My name is Christy Austin, and I'm bringing Just Reading to teachers. The name Just Reading has a double meaning. I focus on providing just what students need, which is evidence-based instructional practices for teaching reading and writing, nothing more, nothing less, while also advocating that reading instruction is one of the most pressing social justice issues of our time. Just Reading is going to dive deep in developing teachers' expertise in implementing evidence-based practices for improving the reading and writing outcomes of students for whom literacy does not come easily. Welcome to the 10 Steps for Mastering Robust Academic Vocabulary Instruction. Over this series, I'm going to dive deep into delivering robust vocabulary instruction, an evidence-based approach that helps students develop a deep and precise understanding of academic vocabulary words across a variety of contexts. After receiving robust vocabulary instruction, students will understand the academic vocabulary words that they will encounter and need to use during listening, reading, and speaking and writing. And we want students to be able to really own those words and have mastery of them. So today we're going to start at the very beginning. Step 1, selecting academic vocabulary words for robust vocabulary instruction. If we're going to invest our precious instructional time teaching words deeply, then we need to make sure that we are teaching and selecting the right words, the ones that are going to give our students the biggest academic payoff. If you've ever thought to yourself, with so many words to choose from, how do I begin to select which words I teach with my limited instructional time? This is the video for you. By the end of this video, you're going to understand how to apply the 3-tiered framework for vocabulary word selection. You're going to know exactly what criteria to use when you're choosing words for instruction, and you'll get to see how to apply this to real texts that your students are reading throughout the school day. The first step must be selecting words for instruction, because here's the truth: not all words are created equal when it comes to vocabulary instruction. We don't want to spend our precious instructional time teaching vocabulary words that students are already familiar with, words like sleep and good and mom and fish. And we also don't want to teach really sophisticated content-specific words like cobblestone that students are unlikely to encounter again. Instead, we want students learning new sophisticated words every single day, and we're also going to want to teach these academic words that students are going to encounter over and over again across all of their classes, because these are the words that are going to help students not just with a single reading passage that they're reading right now, or not just in a single subject, but across their entire school day. They're going to help them become stronger listeners and speakers and become better readers and writers. And that's the key at this very moment. We need to focus on selecting the right vocabulary words for instruction. So let's start at the very beginning with the foundation. Beck, McCown, and Kukan, in the Bringing Words to Life book, developed a 3-tiered framework for categorizing words. And this framework can help us be strategic about which words we teach instructionally. So first, I want to make sure that everyone understands that this framework is not about judging the quality of a student's language. Tier 2 and 3 words are not quote unquote better than Tier 1 words. We're not trying to eliminate a student's use of Tier 1 vocabulary. All human beings use Tier 1 words, these common, frequently used words that are used in everyday conversations. We all use those throughout the course of regular social communication. Words like happy, run, teacher, eat, good. And, it's not that these are bad words. Again, we're not trying to kind of rank order these words. Instead, we're saying, hey, these words are Tier 1 because they are so common and frequently used in everyday conversations that they don't require instruction. Students learn these from their everyday interactions with other people. And so, if I move on, I'm going to skip over from Tier 1 to Tier 3 words. Tier 3 words are these very technical, domain-specific vocabulary words that are tied to a particular content area. Words like photosynthesis in science, or the word denominator in math. A word like peninsula, or legislature, or colonist in social studies, or even the word hyperbole in English language arts. It's not that these words aren't important. They do require instruction, but they only typically appear when students are learning about a particular topic in one subject area, and students are not likely to encounter them over and over and over again across all of their subjects. They're not likely to encounter them throughout the entire school day. And so, we do need to teach these words. We teach them within content area instruction, but we don't typically select them for what I'm going to term robust vocabulary instruction because they're just too specialized. If you think to yourself, well, wait a minute, I need to know exactly how to teach those words. I'm trying to learn how to teach words like photosynthesis or abolitionist. Don't worry, there's going to be a future series on building Tier 3 academic vocabulary understanding. And so stay tuned for that. But now I'm going to move on to Tier 2 words. Tier 2 words are where the magic happens for the instructional strategy called robust vocabulary instruction that we're learning about in this series. Tier 2 words are these high-frequency academic words that are going to appear across a wide variety of subjects. Words like analyze, contribute, establish, sequence, contrast, evident, accumulate. These Tier 2 words are often kind of more sophisticated or are considered close synonyms for more common language that students might already know. For instance, if students know what it means to give something to somebody else, they could learn the word contribute. That's a kind of more sophisticated word to think about how we give things to others. For instance, if a student knows to study something carefully, they could learn the word analyze. That's kind of a more sophisticated, precise word for meaning studying something carefully. So these Tier 2 words that are academic and frequently used across all of the subject areas students will study are absolutely critical for academic success because they're going to show up in the textbooks that students read, in the passages and stories that are read aloud to students. They will be on assessments that students take. They will be included in the writing prompts that students receive that they need to write about. They're used during classroom discourse or conversations about academic topics. These Tier 2 words are really our sweet spot for robust vocabulary instruction. So the question becomes, how do we identify which Tier 2 words to teach? And there's some key criteria that can help us do this. And so the first thing I always think about is, does this word have instructional potential? If I'm selecting a word for robust vocabulary instruction, I want that word to be useful across a wide variety of contexts and content areas. So, I frequently think to myself, will students encounter this word in their reading across subjects? Are they going to need this word in their academic writing, in their discussions? A word like analyze has tremendous instructional potential because students will need it in science. They might analyze the results of an experiment. They might need it in social studies to analyze the motivations of a particular group of people. They might need it in English language arts to analyze a text to determine the theme. They even need it in math when they're analyzing a word problem to determine which pieces of the word problem are relevant to solving the problem and what might be extraneous information. The second question that I want to think about is, do students already have a conceptual understanding for how to explain the meaning of the word? And so students might not know the meaning of the word analyze yet, but if I back up and I think, well, do students understand that if I analyze something, I study it closely? And if I said study something closely, do students know what that language means? If so, they are primed and ready to learn the word analyze because they understand the underlying concept to explain the meaning of that word. They just need the more sophisticated academic label for that concept that they have. So for another example, if students understand what it means to get bigger, they're ready to learn the word expand, that knowledge of increasing their understanding of expand will build on their existing vocabulary. So let's kind of go on. We're not teaching brand new concepts. We're just teaching precise academic language for concepts and language that students already have, words they already know, that they grasp and use regularly. The final question I want to think about is the word important and useful? Does it have high utility? Right? And so I think about, is this word used often in academic discourse in the conversations we have in classrooms and in texts, academic texts? I want to choose words that will appear frequently across academic texts. But I also want to think about, are these words that are less used in casual conversation? So they're less likely for students to master from their everyday interactions with others. When I think about words like reluctant or examine or establish or substantial or indicate, these are words that are used in academic discourse and texts, But I don't run around in my everyday life talking about examining things usually. Instead, I'm just like, let me look at that again, right? We use much more casual language. Even really highly educated adults use much more casual language in everyday conversations. So let's talk about where we find these tier 2 words for instruction. There's a lot of different sources teachers can use to identify these words. First, your primary sources might be looking at the text your students are already reading. If these are texts students are reading across their school day, then these are good sources for academic vocabulary words to come from, because these are the words students will need to know to understand the texts that they're reading about, to learn about all of the wide variety of topics that they're studying across the school day. Hopefully, in your reading curriculum, you're reading both narrative and informational texts, a wide variety of genres. Those texts students are reading are a great place to get the tier 2 vocabulary words students are learning about. Second, I often go to students' content area teachers. I go to their subject teachers like science and social studies and math, and we can do a deep dive into the materials that they are using throughout the school day to pick out some of these words that might apply across contexts. I'm going to leave teaching words like photosynthesis to the science teacher, but I'm going to take a word like analyze and make sure that my students know it, because those are words that are going to come up outside of science. They're going to be used across all subject areas. And so I can go to students' content area teachers to kind of source the materials that they're using to help me identify those tier 2 words. Next, we can discuss getting tier 2 academic vocabulary words from some of our more research kind of aligned lists, like Coxhead's academic word list or Marzano's academic vocabulary. A good old Google search will show you these words. Coxhead's, for instance, has 570 base words or root words that students can learn that appear frequently across a wide variety of texts all the way through the college level. So when we look here, this is a really great starting place for academic vocabulary instruction. And then finally, I also like to look through the state standards, because oftentimes these standards show words that really are necessary for academic vocabulary instruction. And I look at students' assessment materials. What are the words they will need to know to be successful and to demonstrate the knowledge of the things that we are really hoping they master throughout the school day? So now let's take a pause and let's see what this looks like in practice. And so I'm going to model how I think through the word selection process, and I'm going to use a 5th grade science text that I had AI generate to avoid copyright violations. And so the very first thing I'm going to do is read this passage so that I can apply my criteria of thinking about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words. So first, let me read it aloud. The living web of ecosystems. Ecosystems are places where living things interact with each other and their surroundings in many different ways. Plants are incredibly important because they contribute energy to the entire ecosystem through a process called photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make their own food and create oxygen that other living things need to breathe. The energy stored in plants becomes available to all other organisms in the ecosystem. Without plants doing this important job, most life on Earth wouldn't be able to survive. Animals consume plants and other animals to get the energy they need to live and grow. Plant eaters like rabbits and deer feed on leaves and grasses, while meat eaters like wolves and hawks hunt other animals for food. When plants and animals die, special organisms called decomposers go to work. Decomposers such as bacteria, fungi, and worms transform dead material by breaking it down into smaller pieces. As they do this work, they release nutrients that enrich the soil, making it better for growing new plants. This continuous cycle of energy moving from the sun to plants to animals and then back to the soil maintains balance in the ecosystem and keeps it healthy and thriving. And so, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and apply my tiered vocabulary framework. And so, first pass, I'm going to identify some tier 1 vocabulary words. Words like plants, water, food, animals, grow, die, sun, right? To be clear, teachers do not need to engage in this step because these are words that students are going to learn from everyday conversations. I don't need to pick them out. These words do not require instruction. I just want to make sure everyone watching this video can recognize the words that are frequently used across everyday conversations that we call Tier 1 words so that we make sure we're not selecting words students already know to teach instructionally. Next pass, I'm going to look and I'm going to identify some Tier 3 technical words that are very subject specific. And so, of course, this was a passage related to science about ecosystems. And so I can look at this passage and I can pick out some very science specific vocabulary, right? Words like ecosystem or photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, oxygen, organisms, decomposers, fungi, bacteria. These aren't words I use a lot across my everyday social interactions with others. These also aren't words that students are likely to encounter if they go to English language arts or social studies or math class, right? These are words that are very specific to the words that they're going to encounter in science. And so again, it's not that these words don't require any instruction, but I'm going to leave the instruction for these words to science class because they're going to require more lengthy explanations. I can't just give a simple synonym for the word decomposers and move on and assume that students will have it. Explaining the process of photosynthesis is going to require an in-depth explanation. And so these words are just taught a little bit differently than this structure that we are using today. And then finally, I'm going to do a final pass and I'm going to look at some Tier 2 vocabulary words. And so Tier 2 words like interact, surroundings, contribute, process, create, available, survive, consume, transform, release, continuous, maintain, and thriving. I mean, I look at this 2-paragraph passage and I think to myself, wow, there are 13 Tier 2 vocabulary words that appear in just these 2 paragraphs. And so I think, well, clearly there's a lot of Tier 2 vocabulary in this passage, more than I can likely teach in a single lesson. So now the question becomes, how do I choose which words that I'm going to teach? What research would suggest is that we can teach about 6 to 8 new academic vocabulary words through each week through robust vocabulary instruction. And I want to be clear, that doesn't mean students are going to master 8 words in this one lesson. But I might be able to choose 8 words from this passage that I'm going to repeatedly revisit throughout the week with robust instruction, helping students understand these words across a wide variety of contexts. And this pace of about 8 words a week allows for the depth of instruction and those repeated exposures that students need to really truly understand and master and develop a deep and precise understanding of words. If you think about 8 new words a week over the course of a school year, that is over 200 new academic vocabulary words that students have used. And that represents an enormous, substantial expansion of students' academic vocabulary. And so, when I think about how many words I select from this passage, there's not a really clear-cut answer to that. It probably depends on how many words in this passage I think students are likely to encounter over and over again. It might depend upon whether there's any words in this list that I've previously taught. It might depend upon how much time I think I'm going to have to revisit these words throughout the week. For this module, I'm just going to go through and select a handful of Tier 2 vocabulary words that I'm going to use across our 10 steps to delivering robust vocabulary instruction that will help students develop a deep and precise understanding of these words across a week of instruction related to ecosystems in science. And so again, I do a lot of work studying reading interventions for students with reading difficulties and disabilities, but I want to be clear. I can support their science content knowledge while I deliver this instruction if I use the information students are learning about in science, while I'm also helping them become better foundational word readers. And so I've highlighted the 13 words in this short passage. Clearly, I'm going to need to narrow this list to the words that I feel are most important. Teaching 13 words at one time would be way too much. And so I want to find just a handful of these words to teach throughout the course of this passage. And I want to pick the words that students are most likely to encounter and see, again, across a wide variety of subjects when they're talking about all sorts of different learning topics that are important to their school learning. So I'm going to model that process that teachers can use to make these really critical, important decisions about which words to teach. I'm going to consider a few words at a time so we can really do a deep dive into these words and we can think about, hey, out of these sets of words, which words might be higher impact or give us a bigger bang for our buck if we include them in instruction versus other words that we might be able to just explain more briefly. I want to be clear, every word on this list is a tier 2 word. You could not go wrong teaching any of these words to students. But since we don't have unlimited instructional time, I need to be intentional about which words I teach. So I'm going to imagine that I'm selecting words for a hypothetical set of 5th grade struggling readers. And I want to identify words that these 5th grade readers are unlikely to know the meaning of. I don't want to teach words students already know. And so immediately when I look at this list, I look at these words and I think surroundings. Well, number one, I don't hear that form of the word a lot. I hear the word surround a lot, but I don't hear surroundings. That's a word that's pretty specific to talking about a particular environment in science, right? Our surroundings. Now, my students, I think in 5th grade would be familiar with the word surround. Like if you surround something, right, with something else, you're kind of wrapping around it. And so I think they're kind of familiar with the concept of the base word of this word. But I also am not sure this is a word that students are going to hear quite as often as the words interact or contribute. And so that's something I'm kind of keeping in the back of my mind. Now let's think about like how many meanings each one of these words have, because the truth is if a word has multiple meanings, that word is probably likely to be encountered more often because it's used in a lot of different ways. And so if I think about a word like interact, this word has a lot of different meanings. It can be used to mean that something has an effect on something else, like how baking soda, for instance, interacts with vinegar to create a chemical reaction. It can also mean that someone's communicating or socializing or participating in something or collaborating with others. Like mothers interact with their young, they feed them and care for them until they're able to care for themselves. You might interact with your friends on the playground. Individuals might interact when they're playing on a team or in a sports competition together. You might interact with your father to help him change the oil in the car. That's a lot of different meanings. They're all somewhat similar, but they have some differences to them. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, having an effect on something else, like an interaction, causing a chemical interaction, is really different than like collaborating or participating in a group with others. When I think about the word surroundings, there's really only one meaning of that. It refers to the places and things that are around you. And so students are likely to see it across subjects. Like, they might come to science and discuss the surroundings, that were in a particular habitat, for instance, or they might go to social studies and discuss how, individuals, their diets in ancient civilizations depended on the surroundings that were around them. Like if you live by the ocean, you might eat food like fish more often. And, if you were living in the desert, water might be harder to come by because of your surroundings. But it always sort of means the things and places that are around someone. And so, I think I could explain this quickly, and I think my students already know the meaning of the base word surround. And so I'm going to go ahead and cross surroundings off my list. I know I have 13 words on this list. I already do not think surroundings is probably the best bang for my buck on this list. Lastly, I'm going to think about the word contribute. Contribute can mean giving money or support or items or goods to people. Like, you contribute to a food bank, by donating non-perishable food. It can also mean something completely different. It can mean writing for a publication. And, sometimes people will say, well, like, aren't you just providing your writing then? And absolutely, right? But it's a more specific use of the word, right? You're not just giving your writing to others. You are handing over your rights, contributing that for publication to others. The third meaning, if something contributes to something else, it might be one reason why something else happens, like pollution contributing to, climate change in our country. Finally, if you contribute, you might add new ideas or your particular kind of contribution. You might add something to make something else better. Like you might participate in a group project and your contribution is going to make the group project better. The very part you did is going to help contribute to the group's outcome. And so, already I'm thinking to myself, okay, contribute and interact have a lot more instructional potential, I think, than the word surroundings. So I'm going to prioritize those words. Let's do a deeper dive into those words to make sure that we really use those words across a wide variety of subjects. And so when I think about these words, they have multiple meanings. So I might want to consider them. Let's think about how interact might appear in social studies. When I think about the word interact for my fifth graders, they might be learning that the early colonists in America interacted with Native Americans. Some of those interactions were positive. They traded goods. Other interactions were negative. They were competing over land ownership. When I think about our government structure, the federal government interacts with state governments and laws. For instance, historically, the federal government interacted with state laws to abolish slavery. The states in the South wanted to keep slavery intact. The federal government said, no, slavery is unconstitutional, and they abolished it. That was an interaction between state and federal governments. I can think more widely when I think about interactions, internationally or worldwide. Black veterans from America, even though my fifth graders would be studying U.S. history, they might be learning that Black veteran soldiers went and fought in World War II, trying to protect the freedom of American citizens. And while they were going abroad to fight in World War II, they had interactions that exposed them to a life free from the discrimination that they were receiving in America. And so these Black veterans who were fighting for freedom in World War II returned to America. And because of their interactions abroad, they learned that they didn't have to tolerate a life full of discrimination that they were experiencing in America, that there were other places where they could live a much more free life. Now I'm going to think about the word interact in science, right? When I think about science, living things interact with their environments. We can think about how we interact with the environment, how human, everyday life, both positively and negatively, interacts the environment on Earth. We can think about an animal or an insect like a bee interacting with its environment, like a bee interacting with flower. It does so to collect nectar, but in collecting nectar, it's also spreading pollen, which is helping new plants grow. I can think about forces interacting with objects. Students have to learn that, forces cause objects to begin moving, speed up, slow down, and stop moving. And those forces are interactions between the push or pull that created that movement and the object that then begins moving, speeds up, slows down, or stops moving. I can think about how students learn about weathering and erosion. They can think about how water interacts to cause weathering and erosion. Like water, when it freezes, expands. And one of the consequences of that water expansion, that interaction between the water and the rocks, is that it causes water to expand in the cracks of rocks, which causes rocks to break apart, which then facilitates the process of weathering and erosion occurring, where those rocks break down into finer and finer pieces of dirt until they become tiny pieces of, sand or dirt. And, then they kind of move around on Earth. And that process is constantly changing the landforms that exist on Earth. When I think about interact, how students might encounter it in English language arts. This is a word that would be used in academic texts. Students would be reading in English language arts. We talk about characters interacting and forming deep friendships, like Wilbert and Charlotte in Charlotte's Web. We can think about students interacting with the texts that they're reading by annotating those texts, or, interacting with the text to determine the theme of the text. Thinking about how a theme might interact across texts, right? How do the themes, even if they're similar, how do they differ slightly between texts? We might think about how something like the setting interacts with the text to impact the mood of the text. In math, we might think about how two variables interact. Like if you look at this graph, we're looking at the interaction between the month and then the number of inches of rainfall on average. And so you can see in April, in spring, on average, in this particular area, there's a lot more rainfall than once we enter the summer months. That's kind of this interaction between the time of the year, the month of the year, and the number of inches of rainfall on average. We can think about if lines interact, they intersect, and that intersection forms angles. And so we might talk about the interaction of lines once they intersect. We can think about how changing a numerator or denominator interacts to impact the fraction's values. So, if I have a denominator that's unchanged and I increase the numerator, I have a larger part of a whole. And if I have a denominator that increases, I've now split my whole into a larger number of pieces. And so that's an interaction we can think about as well. Finally, if I think about students' everyday lives, students interact with their peers throughout the school day. They interact with video games when they use controllers, or they might interact with their friends using a headset on one of their video games. They might play sports or participate in extracurriculars where they're interacting with others. They might even wish they could forget the awkward interactions that they experienced during their very first school dance. And then finally, when we were thinking about those tier 2 words, I said we have to think about, do students have a conceptual understanding for the words? And so do they have language to express the meaning of a word like interact? And when I think about my hypothetical 5th grade students, those students know what it means to work together with others. They know what it means to go hang out with their friends. They know what it means if something affects something else. Like for instance, a special speaker coming might affect the school schedule. My students would know what that meant. And then finally, they know what it means to participate in something like a group, to interact with others in their participation with others. All right, so, just to back up one more minute, I think all of that speaks to the fact, okay, yes, interact was seen across all of the different subject areas. Students could use it in their everyday lives, which makes this a word that would be beneficial to teach, because if students can use it, they're probably going to develop ownership of it and really, really, truly kind of integrate and incorporate this word into their everyday academic vocabulary for discourse. So now I'm going to go on and do the same thing with contribute. Let's make sure it's used across subjects. So in social studies, geography and landforms contribute to where people settle, which then contributes to the development of towns and cities. When we think about disagreements over slavery, those disagreements contributed to the beginning of the Civil War. Every branch of government contributes to democracy, right? We have the legislative and executive and judicial branches, and we have checks and balances, and that all contributes to the democracy, the vote of the people that we have in our country. In science, the word contribute, we can think about pollution contributing to climate change and global warming, sunlight and water contributing to plant growth, wind, rain, and ice contributing to erosion. The topics my students will be learning about will, likely use the word contribute again in the future. And so social studies, science, check. Contribute shows up in those topics. Now, if I think about English language arts, right, setting might contribute to a mood. Supporting details might contribute to help students identify the main idea. We might ask students to use text evidence to contribute to their argument when they're writing an argumentative essay or taking a stance on a particular topic. Finally, in math, every fraction is going to contribute to make part of a whole, or each individual grade contributes when students are developing the understanding of averaging numbers together. Place value is going to contribute to the total value of a number. Students even have to learn when the number is 41, for instance, that 4 in the tens place doesn't just mean 4. It means 4 tens or 40. And that place value helps contribute to understanding the value of 41. And then finally, contribute in students' everyday lives. So, people might contribute to a food drive by donating canned goods or non-perishables. Students can contribute during group projects by completing their assigned role or doing their part to help the project turn out strong. In English language arts, we might ask students to each write a poem that they're going to contribute to a class book that we are going to publish. And then just like interact, I want to come back and think, well, do my students have the language skills to explain the meaning of this word contribute? I know they don't know this word yet, but can they explain what it means using language they do know? Well, if my students know that they could give canned food to a homeless shelter, for instance, well, now they're ready to learn they can contribute canned food to a homeless shelter. If they know that they can add to something that's happening in a group project, well, they know they can contribute to the end product of a group project. If they understand that they can write something and publish it, they understand they can contribute a poem to their class book. If they understand that if something contributes to something else, it might be a part of what caused something else to happen, then they could understand that, the disagreements about slavery contributed to something like the Civil War. And so I feel like my 5th grade hypothetical students are primed and ready to learn a word like contribute because they have knowledge of all of this simpler language that would help them understand and explain the meaning. All right, so I'm going to go on and do this process one more time. I'm going to go on and kind of model this with one more set of words. And so this next set of words are the words process, create, available, and survive. And again, I want to think about which of these words are students most likely to encounter again. Are some of these words used more often than others? Or are some of these words more likely to come up again and again and again, and others are going to be used less frequently? And as I look at this word list, unlike the previous list where surroundings sort of stood out to me as a word that might be a little less common, these words all seem pretty common. I'm not looking at this thinking there's any words that like students really wouldn't have any understanding of, or wouldn't be likely to encounter again, sorry. So, when I think about a word like process, now I'm going to go through and I'm going to think about, okay, well, which of these words have multiple meanings? Knowing if a word has a lot of different meanings, it's likely to be used often because it's used to talk about a lot of different things. And so, when I think about a word like process, a process is a series of steps followed in order, right? Like you could think about the process for baking a cake, right? There's a series of steps you're going to follow to make the cake. We call that a process. If we process something, we could also be saying that we're using chemicals on something. So for instance, like the food preservation process, right? We put chemicals in our food to help preserve it. It's one of the reasons our food in America is sort of less healthy for people than food in other countries that have more laws that prevent them from using, processes that might be harmful to people's health. A process could also be something that changes or happens naturally, like the aging process, right? Students might hear their parents complaining about the aging process, about how they're developing wrinkles or age spots or gray hair. And, that might be bringing them some woes at the time. And then finally, if you are processing information, you are thinking about something really deeply or thinking about it a lot. And so I look at those are drastically different meanings of the word process. Well, that's what makes process a great tier 2 word, is that this word is used across a wide variety of contexts to mean a lot of different things. And so I'm already looking at this list thinking, check, I want process to be a part of my vocabulary that I'm going to provide instruction on. The next word I want to dig into is create. This is a word that, while I don't know, it is used a lot and it's used in academic subjects. I think my students might know the meaning of this word create. If they go to art class, as their electives and, they're always making something or creating something in art. In fact, I might just pop into the art teacher and ensure that this is a word that the art teacher makes sure to emphasize this week so that students are being exposed to it. But I maybe don't want to spend my instructional time here because I think a good number of my students might know the meaning of this word create. But I want to look at the definitions. If somebody creates something, they build or make it or put something together. Like you might create, a new painting that's going to be shown at an exhibit in the future. You are going to make this new piece of art, this painting that you're going to show. You might also put something together, like you might create a new bookshelf that you bought at IKEA, right? You might have to kind of put the pieces together. It can also mean something a little more specific where you think about bringing something into existence. And so, our government can create new laws. It didn't just kind of make them out of nowhere. It had to bring something new into existence. They had to recognize a problem and then create a solution to that problem, which came in the form of legislation. When I think about those meanings, they mean something really similar, right? Like if you bring something or build something or make something, you could also say you build or make something that's either been made before or is brand new, right? You bring something brand new into existence. But again, I'm not going to teach it. I think my students know it. I'm going to keep on moving. The next word is available. If someone is available, if something's available to buy, for instance, it's free or open to buy. Or if something's available for you to get, like, I have pencils available in the back of the room. My students know those pencils are open for them to go borrow if they need a pencil. It can also mean something a little more specific, less related to academic contexts, right? But if somebody's available, you could say they're not in a romantic relationship right now. I think of this as pretty similar to this first meaning because if somebody's not in a romantic relationship, that means that they're free or open to date other people, right? And so they're available to try to date other people. These meanings are very similar. One of them is not terribly academic. I'm thinking Maybe I want to teach this word through everyday conversations with students, like talking about my pencils being available in the back of my classroom, or, whether or not I'm available at certain times to meet with students outside of class, or, even telling a student who tries to approach me when I'm working with another student, hold on, I'm not available quite yet. Let me finish with this student before I work with you. And so, this is a word I think I can teach more from my everyday interactions with students. It also sort of has this singular meaning, and so I might be less likely to occur as often as a word like process. But again, I've already said, hey, I think available would show up in a lot of different contexts. I just think I can teach it pretty simply. And so I'm not going to select it today. I'm going to use process over the word available. And then finally, I'm going to discuss this word survive. If something survives, it stays alive. So, for instance, we need to water a plant if we want it to survive. Water is one of the things our plants need to survive or stay alive. It can also be used kind of less literally if something continues to function or work or kind of stand after something bad happens. And so, for instance, you might say, my house survived the small fire that occurred. Well, your house isn't literally alive, right? But it does continue to stand and function and work as a house, even though it experienced a small fire, and that's great. It survived the fire, right? And so I think about these meanings pretty similar in meaning. I know this word is important in science. I also know students talk about hey, how many people survived, an epic battle in social studies. This is a word that would be used across contexts. Again, I wonder, might my students know it? I'm not quite sure, but here I'm thinking, I could probably, even if they don't know it, explain it by just saying, if something survives, it stays alive or continues to work. And so because I can explain it so simply, I might not prioritize it quite as much as the word process. And so, when I think about my words, I have interact, I have contribute, and I have process. When I think about process, let's kind of go through and think about, make sure this is used across all of our subjects. In social studies, we have this picture that says new perspectives challenge our assumptions about right and wrong. Well, students have to process those new perspectives so that they can challenge their assumptions of what's right or wrong. And historically, we've had to challenge our assumptions about what's right or wrong to make social progress in this country. When I think about social studies, also, the legislative process determines whether a bill becomes a law. It's important for students to process historical events through multiple viewpoints. And we can think about things, periods in history like the Industrial Revolution when, the process of creating energy had this boom, this explosion. And, with that came the unintended consequences of pollution, for instance. In science, we can think about the process, like the steps that occur in a particular order in the process of photosynthesis. Or the water cycle process. There are also steps that occur in a particular order and repeat over and over again because it's a cycle. We can also think in science how, we process non-renewable resources like oil, coal, and gasoline for energy. And, we process those like we use chemicals to create something else. And so there's all of these different meanings in science and social studies. I'm off to a good start. My selection of the word process feels appropriate. In English language arts, students need to know about the writing process, all of the steps that they use to develop a final draft in their writing. Students also process context clues to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. They might have to process a character's actions to determine their motivations. When I think about math, students need to learn the process of some of these more complex math procedures like long division, right? That the process requires a number of steps students must follow in order over and over again. The process of simplifying a fraction is another thing that students really learn about a lot, and a lot of my students who are struggling learners are still practicing in 5th grade. They need to find the common factors and then use those common factors to reduce that fraction to its lowest terms. Finally, in students' everyday lives, right? They can process the mistakes that they made to earn them detention. They can, think about the process used to purify drinking water. They can think about the process for building bookshelves in their new office. They might hear their parents talking about the aging process. And then finally, conceptual understanding. I need to make sure students have language to explain the meaning of this word process. My students would understand the idea of thinking about something deeply or thinking a lot, thinking really hard about something. My students also understand the idea of steps that they need to follow, that's a process. They're ready to learn the word process. They don't know that word yet, but they do understand that things can happen in a particular order and that those are steps. And they definitely understand that when you add chemicals to something, they have that language within their repertoire. And so they're primed and ready to learn the word process, like, the food preservation process or the pasteurization process. So, I'm going to let you guys work through this final list, and you can work through and think about, out of these words, consume, transform, release, continuous, maintain, and thrive. First, what you would do is stop and think about, well, which of these words might your students already know the meaning of? Are there any words your students already know? If you think your students already know some of these words, those are the first ones you probably cross off your list. We don't want to spend our precious instructional time teaching words students already know. I look at this list, and so again, if you're doing this on your own, pause. You can hear my thinking in a minute when you unpause. But when I look at this list, I think to myself, continuous. My students might not know that form of the word, but they are very familiar with the word continue. I do not know that I need to teach continuous. I can just do a brief discussion of this word and students would walk away with an understanding. Whereas the word consume, I don't think my students know any part of that word, right? They've never really heard it before. It also means a lot of different things. If you consume something, you eat it, right? Literally. But if you consume something, you can also use it up. Like, our class consumes a lot of paper over the course of a school year. Well, we didn't eat the paper, we used the paper up, right? Use up can be used literally, like consuming paper in a classroom, but it could also be used sort of figuratively, like a fire consuming a forest, right? Like it didn't use up the trees in the forest, but it didn't literally eat, the fires don't literally eat things, right? But it got rid of everything, right? Which is like a kind of figurative way to talk about using everything up. If we think about being consumed by something, that means it takes all of our attention, right? Or if we're, consumed in an activity, we might be taking in information. Like I really want people to be consumed in reading because that means it's taking all of their information. And I want them to consume the information I'm teaching in science class. I want them to take in that information and really develop ownership and mastery of it. That's a lot of different meanings, all used in really different ways. This is a word I'm thinking, yes, great instructional potential, right? I can go through and I could do the same thing with this list, but I'll let you all think through this list. If I was moving through this list, I would come through and I would choose the word consume because it has this potential across social studies, like early civilizations consuming natural, renewable resources like water and sunlight to make their lives easier. The Industrial Revolution, changing how resources were produced that increased human consumption. In science, I could think about how plants consume carbon dioxide, the gases that are harmful to humans, and they produce oxygen, making our air healthier and cleaner. I could think about decomposers, like in this passage, students are reading about their ecosystems. Decomposers consume dead and organic material, and that helps them provide the soil with more nutrients. Organisms are part of a food chain. Organisms each consume something, right? Here in this food chain, grasshoppers consume grass. The grass consumes sunlight for energy, right? It uses sunlight for photosynthesis to create and produce its own energy. There's secondary consumers like frogs that consume insects like grasshoppers. And so everything within this food cycle, this food chain, are consuming something to get their energy. In English language arts, protagonists might be consumed by guilt after betraying someone, or we might be consumed with a book that we're reading. We're so absorbed we just can't put it down. Students need to monitor their own understandings to make sure that they're consuming the most important information when they're reading these dense expository informational texts. In math, they might run into this word when they think about, if a factory consumed 250 gallons of water in 1 hour, how many gallons of water would be consumed by the factory in 8 hours? They might show up in word problems, right? We also want them to consume the information we're talking about in math class. In their everyday lives. Teenagers are really consumed sometimes with their thoughts of their crushes or the people that they kind of are attracted to. Students might complain if homework consumes all their free time after school and they don't have time to play video games. And they might complain about that because they become so consumed by video games that it seems like that's all they want to do. Lastly, I might think about, do students have the language to explain the meaning of consume? I know my students don't know the word consume yet, but do they have language to explain what it means? Do they know if they eat something what that means? Well, absolutely. These are typically developing fifth graders. Do they know about what it means to use something up? Sure. Do they know what it means if something takes all of your attention, or if you really devote your attention and then you take in new information? They know all of those concepts. And so they are primed and ready to learn the word consume. This might be a great word. I could do the same thing with maintain, right? Maintain, like our government maintains balances of power with checks and balances. Aqueducts and irrigation systems maintain water supplies to cities and farms. We can think about science. Plants and animals like polar bears maintain their body temperature by having all of these internal and external structures like blubber and thick fur that help them stay warm in the Arctic cold. I could think about friction preventing objects from maintaining their speed. Friction causes a moving object to slow down. We study that during physical science. In English language arts, authors maintain suspense by creating a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter. A strong writer is going to maintain focus on their topic by writing a topic sentence and then providing supporting details for that topic sentence and then re-summarizing their topic sentence in the end with a concluding sentence. Characters are going to maintain their composure in a tough situation. In math, students can look at graphs that might show how temperature maintains a steady rate of increase if it's a linear graph. To maintain a balanced equation in math, students have to learn that they perform and do the same thing on both sides of the equation. They perform the same operation. Here to solve 12 equals 12x, students need to divide by 12 to maintain equality on this side of the equation and this side of the equation. In students' everyday lives, they learn that being thoughtful and kind will help them maintain friendships. They learn that constant cleaning is needed to maintain a tidy classroom or a tidy home. They learn that they need to maintain their focus if they want to finish their homework fast. Do they have the conceptual understanding? Are they primed and ready to learn maintain? Well, they know what it means to fix something, so they can maintain a home, for instance, or they can maintain their boat by doing some repairs. If they know what it means to take care of something, well, then they're ready to learn the word maintain. And if they can understand keeping something the same, like you maintain your health by exercising regularly, you keep your health the same, right? You want to kind of maintain it over time. You don't want it changing and deteriorating. We keep it the same, we maintain it. So I think my students have a conceptual understanding of these words, this language that's used to explain. They are primed and ready to learn maintain. And so all of this to say, now I have a final list of tier 2 words that I want to use for instruction. I have kind of pared my list down from a set of 13 words to a final set of 5 words that I'm going to teach across this passage, and then I'm going to repeatedly encounter throughout the school day and throughout the remainder of the week so that students can develop a deep and precise understanding of the meaning of these words. And so, by the end of step 1, let's do a little review. My hope was that you would be able to explain how to use a tiered vocabulary framework to differentiate between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary words. And so in this module, in step 1, what we learned is we don't teach tier 1 words. They are far too common, and students learn them through everyday conversations. They already know their meanings, and if they don't, like let's say they're English learners who still have not acquired some foundational tier 1 English vocabulary, they're going to continue learning them through their everyday interactions with other English speakers. Tier 2 words are our sweet spot for robust vocabulary instruction. We want those tier 2 words that are academic. They're more precise, sophisticated ways to explain concepts students already understand. They're used across a wide variety of subjects and to talk about a wide variety of different topics. And so these are the words we want to select for our repeated vocabulary instruction that's going to repeatedly help students encounter and use these words across listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We'll dive into what that instruction looks like as we continue to move throughout this module. And then finally, tier 3 words are those technical, domain, subject-specific words. It's not that they don't require instruction. A word like photosynthesis needs to be taught, but I cannot just teach it across a wide variety of subjects. Students are not likely to go use this word during their everyday language conversations with others, even if they're having academic language conversations. They are only going to use that word in science class when talking about the topic of photosynthesis. And then finally, my hope was that you would learn to evaluate a list of potential tier 2 vocabulary words to identify the 3 to 5 vocabulary words from a grade level passage that had the greatest instructional potential. And so, my goal was that we would walk away with the understanding that we can't teach 13 words at one time. We want to select over the course of the week up to about 8 vocabulary words that we're going to teach deeply by repeatedly revisiting those words over and over again throughout the week across a wide variety of contexts. And so to model this practice, I selected 3 to 5 vocabulary words that I would teach in this particular passage. We picked words students would be likely to see again. We picked words that students likely would not know the meaning of. And we picked words that had a lot of different meanings, knowing those were words that were likely to encounter, students were likely to encounter over and over again, and that understanding those words on a deep level would require some repeated instruction, looping back to those words over and over again. And so, check, we've learned how to use that tiered vocabulary framework. We've also learned how to kind of consider things that will help us distinguish between tier 2 words that might have strong instructional potential and those that we might be able to just explain more quickly, or those we think our students might know the meaning of. So that's it for today. Coming up next, we're going to talk about step 2, developing not using dictionary definitions, because these definitions that are from the dictionary are really ineffective for teaching the meaning of words. We can't just have students look up words that they don't know. That's not an effective strategy for helping students to develop deep and precise understanding of vocabulary words. Instead, we're going to learn about how to create what I'm going to term student-friendly explanations for these vocabulary words. Again, my name is Christy Austin with Just Reading, and I'm here bringing just evidence-based practices, nothing more, nothing less. We're talking about how to teach reading and writing to students for whom reading and writing does not come easily, because all students deserve just reading instruction. Stay tuned for next week for step 2.